Hello and welcome to Nithrania YouTube channel. You're watching another episode of the Game in a Nutshell series designed for explaining the board game rules. My name is Branislav Berec and in this video we're going to learn how to play Sparta, Struggle for Greece from Plague Island Games. It's a two-player game, it also has a solo rules. And before we start, let me say that all the components in this video are prototype components, so they're not final yet. So without any further ado, let's get started. To set the game up, choose a scenario and follow the setup for that specific scenario. I'm going to set up a Peloponnesian war, so I'm going to use this left side of the turn track. For the Theban war, you would use the right side. Place these regional and these ally control tiles on the matching spaces on the game board. Then distribute these military assets on the matching spaces on those control tiles, and also these cubes and discs which represent influence in these spaces. There are three types of spaces in the game. The circular ones are called polis with one symbol here. These are metropolis with two symbols and megapolis with three symbols of a region. This place is called a colony which doesn't exist at the start of the game. It may be established over the course of the game by placing the token on the space. Now all spaces of one color and also one specific symbol form one region. So looking at the map, we have 11 regions in total. And then we have 5 ally spaces which are not part of any region. Then here we have a space where both players will place their military assets. Here we have the tracks for the army strength and the navy strength. And here we have the space for the allied fleets. Those are the same tokens as these military assets. And finally, the battle strength is used during battles. Then each player takes the player board and the leaders which are determined by the scenario. And these miniatures represent armies and these represent fleets. Then prepare the action cards and the battle cards. Shuffle all the battle cards and create the draw deck. And when preparing the deck of action cards, for the first 2 turns of this scenario, we will need the cards from this Archidemian War. So locate all the action cards which have this Archidemian word in this bottom left hand corner. It is completely irrelevant what is stated on the right side of the card. Look for the Archidemian War label. Then shuffle those cards, deal 6 to each player. And then choose one random setup card for the chosen scenario and follow the additional setup instruction from that card. Each scenario of the game is played over 6 turns and each turn has several phases. In the first phase, what I call the maintenance phase, you will first do the regional assessment, which means players will determine the control of various regions and allies. The next step is called the Hoplite Reset step, in which you will reset the army strength and the navy strength. The next step is called the Shipbuilding step, in which players may increase their navy strength. The next step is called Recruitment, in which players may rehire the lost military assets and place them back into these boxes. And the last step is called Rebuilding. If any of the cities have been raided in the previous turn, the raided marker is removed, which illustrates that the cities have been rebuilt. The next phase is called the action rounds, in which players will alternate taking these rounds, and in each round they will play one card and resolve that card. And in addition, they will be able to mobilize new armies, deploy armies that have been mobilized already, and potentially raid the cities, conduct siege, or battle enemy forces. Then after both players have played all their cards, there is a next phase called Olympic Games, in which players will simply roll dice and gain favor or money. And then at the end of the turn, new leaders may come into play, and also new cards may be added to the deck. The game ends at the end of turn 6, and then simply the player who controls the most regions wins the game. The first phase is called Regional Assessment. In this phase you will check each region and each ally on the map to determine control. Regions are all spaces of one color while allies are just one space. Each space has an autonomy value from 1 to 3, and that value indicates how much influence is needed to control that space. It also indicates the maximum influence one player can have in the city. If you reach that autonomy level, so if you have enough influence, you control that city and you can place a disc in that city. If you don't have enough influence yet, use cubes. Each cube represents one influence. To control an ally, you will always need 2 influence, and if you do, again, place a disc on that ally. The owner of the region is the player with the highest autonomy level of controlled spaces. So spaces where players have discs. So for example, in this red region, Sparta player has 1 plus 3 autonomy value, that is 4 because that player controls these 2 cities. But this yellow region is not controlled by anyone because no player controls any space in that region. If, for example, the situation would look like this, Sparta player would have 1 autonomy value from controlled spaces and the Athens player would have 2 autonomy value, which means the Athens player would control the region. The Corinth city doesn't count because nobody controls that city yet. If no player controls any space in the region, or if players are tied, here we have 3 autonomy value for Sparta player and also 3 autonomy value for the Athens player, then no player controls that region. If there is a player who controls the region, that player takes the region control tile and all the rewards from that tile. In this example, it would be 1 talent, which is a currency of the game, and you can place the talent in this treasury area on your player board. And then all the military assets, which are then placed on the corresponding spaces on the game board. Don't flip those tokens. The same applies to the allies. If you control an ally, take the talents and place the military assets in the corresponding spaces. In addition to rewards from the control tokens, also take the state income. One last note, later in the game, if the region was controlled by 1 player, but the other player increases the influence so that they are now tied for the region, return the control token back to the map and also return the military asset markers to that control token. Then in the first turn of the game, the remaining maintenance phases like hoplite reset, shipbuilding, recruitment and rebuilding are skipped, so I'm going to explain them later in the video. At the start of the action rounds phase, deal each player 6 cards, and you can skip this step in the first turn of the game because you do it as part of the setup. Now, starting with the Sparta player, players will alternate taking these action rounds, playing 1 card each round, until they both play 6 cards and 6 action rounds. During each action round, a player will thematically simultaneously play a card and resolve the card, raid a place and potentially start a siege, deploy mobilized armies on the map, and in the meantime mobilize new armies. Now, in order not to break this simultaneous timing, the action round has a specific sequence. First, if you have any deployed armies, you may raid that space and either go home or start a siege. Then in the second step you will play a card and resolve the card. Then if you have a mobilized army, which means you have an army with the leader, you may deploy that army to the map, to an enemy or even neutral space. Then you may assign a leader to another army and mobilize that army. Then if you have a siege, you may roll dice to remove the influence in that space. And if you deployed your army against an enemy army, in the 6th step you will resolve battles. Now I'm going to cover all these steps in more detail. So in the first step, if you have any deployed armies, you may raid that space. You may either raid and go home or start a siege. You may not raid a city with this raided marker because that indicates that the city has been already raided this turn, but you can start a siege there. So to perform the raid, first add influence so that the space is under full control of the opponent. If it already was under control, you don't have to do anything. Then take one talent and place it in your treasury, and then place a raided token on that space. Such space is called contested and doesn't count as controlled by that player until the raided marker is removed. Then the raiding player either returns home, in which case the army returns back to the player board and the leader is placed in this spent leaders area, or you may start a siege and place a siege token on that space. If you start a siege with your trireme, your soldiers must first get off of a ship. So it's no longer a naval operation, it's a land operation. So you have to replace that trireme with any available hoplites from your player board. If you wouldn't have the hoplites, you may not start the siege. After you choose the hoplite, place the leader next to the corresponding army and place the hoplite next to the space, and then this round or the following action rounds you may prosecute a siege. Prosecuting a siege is step 5 of your action round, so we'll get there in just a moment. In the second step, you may play and resolve one card. This is a mandatory step, so if you do have a card, you must play and resolve the card. Alternatively, if you have 2 favor tokens, you may discard or spend those favor tokens, and instead of resolving the card, you may simply discard it. If the card has this remove keyword at the bottom of the card, if you resolve that card, it must be removed from the game. However, if it is discarded by any game effect, it is not removed from the game. Many cards will allow you to send envoys. You can send these envoys to any spaces or allies. There are almost no restrictions other than that you may not send it to any contested spaces, which means raided spaces or spaces under siege. With lesser envoy, you may either add one your influence to the space or remove one influence of your opponent from the space. One or the other, not both. Remember, when you add influence to a space and now you have the same value as the autonomy value, you control that space, so place your disc there. With greater envoy, you may add or remove 2 influence, but only from one space on the map. So in this example, the first influence would remove the token of the other player, and with the second influence, you would place your own cube on that space. Anytime you can send an envoy, you may choose to send it to your capital city if it's neutral or friendly, and not contested. Which means it doesn't have the raided marker or under siege marker. The third step of your action round is deploying your troops. If you have any mobilized army, which means an army has the leader assigned to that army, you must deploy that army or demobilize it. Let's talk about the hoplites first. When you deploy a hoplite, you may deploy it to any neutral city or hostile city. Neutral cities don't have any influence. Hostile cities have influence of the opponent. You may not deploy hoplite to any friendly cities. Those are cities where you have an influence. Obviously, you're not going to attack your own cities. Then, to deploy a hoplite to a space, you must be able to trace a path to that space from either your capital, and that capital must be friendly, not necessarily controlled, or from the controlled megapolis, so in this case it must be controlled, having the friendly megapolis is not sufficient, or from your controlled colony, or from any controlled ally. You may also trace a path from a space with a friendly hoplite currently sieging. Not just raiding, it must be sieging. When tracing the path from, let's say, capital city in this case, you must follow the road, and you can only pass through the spaces which are friendly or neutral or contested. You may never go through spaces which contain enemy influence. In addition, you may never trace a path through a space which is either neutral or friendly, however it contains enemy armies. These spaces are called colonies, and at the start of the game they actually don't exist. And the same applies to these roads Until the colony is built, even these roads don't exist. One last note, you can deploy a hoplite to a space which is a harbor space if that space is reachable by roads. So that means even if you control this ally, you would not be able to deploy hoplite to this space or this one because there is no road from that ally. When you deploy a mobilized trireme, you may deploy it to any harbor space on the map, either neutral or hostile, and it can be any harbor space anywhere on the map. You don't have to trace any path. By the way, you may deploy more than one army during the same step if you have those armies mobilized. Then another option how to deploy armies is to deploy them to fight enemy armies. In that case, you deploy trireme to fight an opponent trireme, or hoplite to fight another hoplite, and you can deploy them anywhere on the map. Again, there are no restrictions and no path required. This triggers the battle, which I'm going to describe in the step 6. As I already mentioned, if you have a mobilized army, which means there's a leader next to an army, you must either deploy that army or demobilize. You may choose not to deploy the army, so when you demobilize, you move the leader back to the ready state, ready area. However, since mobilization costs some talents, you would not get those talents back. Then the next step, step number 4, is mobilization. To mobilize, you have to spend 3 talents, and then you move any leader from the ready area to an army. So either a trireme army or the hoplite army. During one action round, you can mobilize as many armies as you want, as long as you can pay for that mobilization. One leader can only be assigned to one army, and vice versa, one army can only have one leader. When you mobilize, you may also pay 2 talents and draw 1 random battle card into your hand. Since mobilization is step 4 and deploying is step 3, remember, if you mobilize these armies now, you will have to deploy them in the next action round. If you find yourself in a very difficult situation, you may use this Desperate Times token. When you do, flip it to the other side, and it allows you to mobilize 1 army for free without spending any talents, and then immediately deploy that army to fight an enemy army. You may not deploy it to other spaces, you can only deploy it to fight an enemy. Then in the 5th step, you may prosecute a siege. To do that, you have to spend 2 talents, and then you can choose a siege. You can choose each siege once per round. For each other siege, you have to pay 2 additional talents. To perform the siege, you have to roll dice. The number varies from 0 up to 3. Generally, you always have 1 die available. Then, if you control more adjacent spaces than your opponent, you gain 1 additional die, and you may gain 1 additional die if your army strength is 9 or 10. In this case, when you conduct a siege against the non-harbor space, in this example, if you would conduct a siege against a harbor space. Then you get 1 additional die if you besiege Sparta, and 1 fewer die if you besiege Athens. Now, roll the dice, and for each success, which is value 4, 5 and 6, remove 1 influence from the contested space. Values 2 and 3 have no effect, and if you roll at least 1 failure, which is value 1, reduce your army strength by 1. Then, if your opponent still has any influence in that space, you may keep your hoplite in that space and continue the siege next action round, or you may abandon the siege, which means you will immediately end the siege, remove the siege token but keep the raided token in that space, return your army back to your player board, and roll another die to determine the fate of your leader. If you roll a success or 2 and 3 nothing happens, move your leader to the spent area. However, if you would roll 1, the leader is killed and is permanently removed from the game. If, however, you manage to remove all the influence from that space, you win the siege and you gain number of talents equal to the autonomy value of the city, in this case 3 talents. Remove the siege token and also remove the raided token as well, because before you leave you help rebuild the city. You now control that city and now your army can return home and again place the leader in the spent area. Finally, the 6th step of your action round is the battle. Battle occurs when you have your army against an enemy army in one space. If you have more than one space with battles, you can choose the order. During the battle, you will calculate the battle strength of both sides. First, check the military assets box, this one for the land battles, the other one for the sea battles. In each category, calculate the number of the military assets for each player, and the player with a higher number wins that category. The standard side counts as 1 point, this elite gold side counts as 2 points. So here Sparta player has 4 value in the elite section, Athens player has nothing, so use one of the discs of that player to mark the advantage. In the skirmishers section, Sparta player has this gold Macedon warrior, which has a value of 2 points, while the Athens player only has the standard side of this Thrace warrior, which means 2 to 1, again another advantage for the Sparta player. Do the same for the cavalry, and then each disc counts as 1 battle strength for that player. So we have 2 points of the battle strength for the red player and 1 point of the battle strength for the blue player. So currently the Sparta player wins by 1 battle strength point. Then for the land battles, check the army strength. The player with the higher strength gains 1 battle strength point, so that's another point for the Sparta player. And finally, the home ground advantage. The player who controls that region gains 1 additional battle strength point. In this example, it's the Athens player because they both control 1 space. However, the blue player controls the space with 2 points of autonomy and the red player only 1 point. So that is 1 point for the blue player. Then in the next step, both players will have a chance to play battle cards. But first, if any player has maximum 2 battle cards in their hand, that player may draw 1 additional card for free. You can have maximum 6 battle cards in hand. If you would have more than 6, you must discard down to 6. Now, starting with the attacker, let's say the Sparta player. Players will alternate either playing a battle card or passing. When you play a battle card, apply the effects of the card. One section applies to land battle, the other for sea battle or sea and land, so choose the corresponding effect. Then the other player may play a battle card resolving the effect. Then again the attacking player, and continue like this until both players pass consecutively. When the card effects allows you to promote an asset, you may switch that asset from the regular side to the upgraded gold side. So now it counts as 2 points for that category. On the other hand, if you have to reduce the asset, if it is the veteran asset, reduce it down to standard level. And if you have to reduce the standard military asset, remove it from this box completely. When you promote or reduced assets, don't forget to recheck the advantage and adjust accordingly if necessary. If you do, don't forget to update the battle strength table. When both players consecutively pass playing the battle cards, the battle is over and the player with the higher battle strength wins the battle. In case of a tie, there's no winner. Battle cards played are discarded to the discard pile. Now roll the die to determine the fate of that leader. If you roll a success, 4, 5 or 6, the leader becomes experienced and is flipped to the other side. On the other hand, if you roll 1, the leader is killed and is permanently removed from the game. Note that when you lose the not a named leader, which are the 3 generic leaders you gain at the start of the game, these are not killed, these are actually placed as the spent leaders. However, if your named leader is killed, that one is removed from the game. Then resolve the consequences of the battle based on who won the battle. The winner gains 1 favor token, reduces the army strength by 1, and if you win by 3 battle strength points or more, you may reduce 1 military asset of your choice of the opponent's forces that participated in the battle. The losing player loses 2 army strength. If the result of the battle was the tie, a draw, both players lose 1 army strength. Then both players move their leaders to the spent area, and if the leader is experienced, that leader remains experienced. And both players also return their hoplites to their player board, to their corresponding spaces. And in case the space was a siege and the sieging player loses the battle, they must return home, so back to the player board. The siege is ended, however, the space is marked with a raided token. If the sieging player wins the battle, they may stay on the space and continue sieging next round. The sea battles worked in the exact same way as the land battles with one exception. You calculate the battle strength points from these allied fleets. The player with a higher value here gains 1 battle strength. Then the player with a higher navy strength gains 1 battle strength point. And finally, 1 battle strength is awarded to the player with the home advantage. This is the same as in the land battles. After both players have taken 6 action rounds, perform the end of turn procedure. If any player has any armies that have not raided yet or begun a siege, you can either immediately remove them from the map and return them back to your player board, or you may roll a die for that army. If you roll success, so 4, 5 or 6, nothing happens and the army stays on the map. If you roll 2 or 3, the army is returned to your player board and the leader of that army is spent. However, if you roll a failure, the army is removed from the map, but this time the leader of that army is killed, so permanently removed from the game. Then if you have any mobilized armies which have not been deployed yet, they will not be deployed and the leader is spent. Then take all the spent leaders and make them ready again. Then advance the turn marker and add the depicted leaders to the ready leaders of both players. And when you enter a new era, add the corresponding cards to the deck of action cards as well. However, don't add the discard pile to the draw deck, only the new cards. Then take all the battle cards, this time including the discard pile, shuffle them and create the new draw deck. The next phase is called the Olympic Games and both players will roll 2 dice. Now, do you remember those armies that were still on the map at the end of the turn? You had a chance to remove it right away or roll a die for that army to see what happens. During the Olympic Games, both players should cease fire, but if you breach that truce by rolling a die and trying to keep the army on the map, you would roll 1 fewer die during the Olympic Games. But if you have decided to remove that unit right away, you would roll 1 additional die during the Olympics. Then roll the dice and the player with the most successes wins the Olympic Games. In case of a tie, the player who controls fewer regions wins the tie, and if still tied, then the Sparta player wins the Olympics. Then the winner of the Olympic Games chooses either 1 favor or 1 talent. So let's say the blue player wins the Olympics and gains favor. The other player gains the other reward. Then if this is the end of turn 6, the game ends and proceed to final scoring. Otherwise, simply proceed to the next turn. The next turn starts with the regional assessment, which we have already covered. Then the next step is the hoplite reset. The player who currently has the lower army strength sets the strength to 5, the player with a higher strength sets the strength to 6. If your current strength would be 0, you would set the strength to 4. If currently both players would have the same army strength, they would both set it to 5. Now adjust that strength. If we have still any ongoing siege, friendly siege on the map, you would reduce that strength by 1, and if you control any megapolis, the space with the autonomy value of 3, you can increase your army strength by 1 for each such controlled megapolis. Then in the next step, the shipbuilding step, players may increase their navy strength. To do that, you have to spend talents in the space where you currently have the marker to move to the next space. Start with the player with the lowest strength, then the player with the higher strength, and then again player with the lowest strength. So in this example, the Sparta player would be able to spend a talent and increase the strength by 1. Then the Athens player would have to spend 2 talents if they want to and increase their strength by 1. And again the Sparta player would have to spend 2 talents and increase the strength by 1. If the navy strength of both players would be the same, then both players can increase that strength once, starting with the Athens player, and then the Sparta player would also have a chance to increase that strength. Then in the recruitment step, players will have a chance to recruit eliminated assets back to their boxes. Again, players will alternate taking these turns, starting with the Spartan player. On your turn, you may spend 1 talent and recruit 1 unit to the corresponding box. When you recruit those units, you always recruit them with the standard side up. You may recruit as many units as you want, as long as you can afford recruiting those units. And finally, in the rebuilding step, remove all the raided markers from the map. However, the siege tokens in active sieges still remain on the map. The game ends at the end of turn 6, and then the player who simply controls the most regions on the map wins the game. Allies are not counted. So that's how you play Sparta, Struggle for Greece. If you have any questions or comments, I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. If you like the series, please subscribe. You can support the channel on the Patreon page or under the video, clicking the thank you button and sending us some symbolic support. You've been watching Game in a Nutshell. My name is Branislav Berec and hope to see you next time.